So I had an interesting experience this morning. My wife thinks it has to do something with the vaccine I got yesterday because I had some reaction to it. All night I had fevers, chills, nauseated. But this morning something interesting happened. I woke up. I was pretty tired. I didn't sleep good. Told my wife I'd be back for a little bit. I needed some fresh air, and so I went to a local park. And I just was walking through the park. Felt a little exhausted, sat down on a bench, and just began to daydream. When all of a sudden a man approached me, and he walked straight up to me, and he said, "Hello there, is it okay if I sat with you?" A little bit strange, but I said, "Sure, go ahead, I can use some company." And he introduced himself as John, and he said, "I hear you're an educator." Now this part was a little strange to me. I had never seen this man, I had never met him, and so I was a little bit weirded out, but I went ahead and I played along. I said, "Yeah, I've been teaching for about 10 years. I love my job. But it's been crazy this year with COVID. The pandemic and the shutdown and all that, it's made it really difficult." And then he looked at me, and there was a twinkle in his eye, and he said, "Is it okay if I ask you a few questions? I love talking with teachers." A little strange, but I said, "Sure." He said, "The first thing, Dave, what do you teach?" And I looked back and I said, "John, I teach elementary school, which means I teach everything. I teach math, reading, writing, science, PE, art, everything. And sometimes it feels, John, like I'm teaching everything just an inch deep, but a mile wide." And then he looked at me and he said, "David, you got to remember that it's not about the product. It's about the process." He said, "While math and reading, grammar, it's important and it has a role, it can quickly become remote," he said, "and dead, abstract and bookish." He says, "Dave, you have to have a balance between this factual schooling, the didactics, but also raising learners." And then he said, "If you're going to make an error, make sure you make it as you raise learners." He says, "Dave, the good curriculum is not about teachers today, it's about the learners tomorrow. We don't know what tomorrow holds, right? If we teach students as we taught them yesterday, we're robbing them of tomorrow." He says, "David, you gotta make your children into thoughtful, diligent, self-motivated, accountable learners. Don't ever forget that, David." At this point, I sat back a little bit and I thought, this isn't just some regular Joe. Who is this John guy? And then he looked back at me and he says, so how do you teach all of these subjects?" At this point, I sat a little tall and I said, "Well, John, I don't want to brag, but I was nominated Teacher of the Year with my district. I've led different professional developments on my teaching strategies, my pedagogy." And he says, No, David. How do you teach?" And I sat there quiet. And he says, "Dave, every teacher has to make every effort to make the present experience as rich and significant as possible. Because remember, this is student-centered." He says, "None of that works. Math, science, English, reading, none of that works unless the student has interest." So, I want you to think about this, David. He says, true learning requires discovery, requires experience. It needs kids to just jump in and get their hands dirty. And always remember never to rob a student of an experience, just to insert your own. At this point, it was getting stranger and stranger, but I went ahead and I grabbed my phone. I began to take some notes here. And then he says, well, David, so my last and final question, but probably the most important, he says, why do you teach? I looked at him and I said, John, to be honest, I teach because I believe that education is freedom. My parents did not have a high school diploma. They didn't even go to college, and they pushed it on me, and I was able to become anything I wanted to be. That's why I teach, to help and influence the next generation. And when I said that, he leaned in and he gave me a little hit on the shoulder, and he says, you got it, David. You got it. Remember, the goal of learning is to develop the capacity to learn more. He says, don't create robots in the classroom, create learners. Because education is not just preparation for their life, education is life itself. He then went on and said, knowledge is a verb, it's ongoing, and even as an educator, you know that, correct? And I looked at him, I said, yeah, you're absolutely right, John. I've never stopped learning, ever since I began. He says, that's what you need to teach. I looked up for a moment and I said, well, yeah, John, and I looked back and he was gone. He was absolutely gone. I looked around and it became very strange. I didn't realize where he went. I didn't think too much about it. I figured maybe I'm hallucinating things from my vaccine. I don't know. I went ahead and walked home, and I was reading this book by this old philosopher, this educational guy named John Dewey. And as soon as I opened it, there was this little message. And it says, David, I had a pleasure speaking with you today. Keep it up. Signed, John. It was at that moment I realized that my interaction earlier was not with some stranger, but it quite possibly was John Dewey himself. And even though it was for a few minutes, it was so rich and deep. And I'll never forget it, because it changed the way